Livingston, taking place in Houston, Texas, on March the 8th, 1996. The interviewer is Dr. Vernon L. Williams of the Department of History at Abilene Christian University. JB, is it all right for me to call you JB?
Yes, it is.
If you would you tell us a little bit about where you grew up, who your parents were, and a little bit about your family background?
Well, of course, I was born in 1920, and at that time, my family lived on a little farm about 3 miles out of a town called Livingston, South Carolina. And I lived there until I was about 15, in which at that time we moved to a little village called Woodford, South Carolina, where I went to high school from there at a little town about 4 miles away from Woodford called North South Carolina. And that's where I graduated from high school. I spent a year after high school working on the farm with my father and the rest of the family. I had 4 brothers and 1 sister. My father was named Talmadge Livingston, and he was raised on the farm that I was born on. My mother's name was Rebecca Livingston, so I was a Livingston for both sides. And we lived on a farm throughout my life until when I was 18, I guess. I went to Wofford College in Spartanburg, South Carolina, which at that time was a men's Methodist school college, a liberal arts college. And there, while I was in Wofford, I took ROTC training. So consequently, in 1941, when the war broke out, the day the war broke out, I was working in the mess hall of Carlisle Dormitory in Wofford, at Wofford. And I was serving the noon meal at the time we heard about the war breaking out in Pearl Harbor. So, but my class, which I was a senior I was not a senior that year, but we were able to go to summer camp during the summer, and then we graduated in 1942. And being in ROTC, we graduated with a second lieutenant commission. Consequently, that meant we immediately went into the war service. The first place I was assigned was at Fort Knox, Kentucky, in the armored part of the Army. Fort Knox was the center of all the armored service activities in schools and so forth. We spent 2 months there in training, which was essentially what our only officer training that we had, other than what we had while we were at Wofford. From there, we went to maneuvers in California, in the desert in California. At the time, Patton was out there also training. We spent 2 months out there, and then we were assigned to the 12th Armored Division, which was being activated at Camp Campbell, Kentucky, which was what it was called at that time. So after we got through with the 2 months maneuvers in California, which we got some experience, some good field experience in the tanks. From there we went to Fort Campbell and joined the 12th Armored Division.
Before we go on and take a look at your entry into the division, you tell me a little bit about the training at Fort Knox. Was it essentially a sort of an officer orientation kind of a course? What kinds of things did you do? Classes and that kind of thing?
Well, yes, it was called Officers Orientation Course for officers like myself who just come out of ROT schools. And during the training, we were exposed to arms extensively. We took the training in the rifles, machine guns, tank guns, and guns of all types. We also had exposure to maintenance school service, because being in tanks, we had a lot of maintenance to keep up with it, and as officers, we were supposed to know as much about that as anybody, I guess. But we had a lot of training in maintenance, and we also had training in activities involving the actual application of troops in the field. We did problems. We did quite a number of problems in the field, which we were exposed to how officers should operate in administrative parts of the service also. And it was, as far as I'm concerned, it was an excellent course that we needed, and we came out of there pretty well prepared to go to the field and put our training into action.
What about maneuvers? Did the men that you trained with at Fort Knox go with you in mass? In other words, were you with people you knew?
No, actually, we were assigned to our outfits that we would eventually report to before we left Fort Knox. So consequently, each man there, we were in a class of about 50 officers. And of those 50, I went to the 12th Armored Division, and I believe there was about 3 other officers in training with me that went to the 12th Armored also. So I know one went to artillery, one went to ordnance battalions, and I think I was the only one that I can recall that actually went to a tank battalion, which is where I was assigned when I got to the 12th Armored.
Which battalion?
I was assigned to the 43rd Armored Regiment at that time, and later it was divided up into battalions and ended up in the 43rd Armored Battalion, or 43rd Tank Battalion, I believe it's usually called.
What about the maneuvers before you get to Campbell? Can you tell us a little more about the kinds of things you learned? After all, you're only about 2 months out of college. Must have been different for you.
Yes, it was. But being raised on a farm, I was used to a lot of hours during the day involved in activities, and it was certainly like that when we got on maneuvers, because we joined our outfits that we were assigned to for the maneuvers while they were in the middle of a project or a problem, we called it, and that meant that everybody was out in a position on an active problem that was taking place, which I got to a tank one night about midnight, and that was where I was going to spend the next 2 months. And everybody was dirty, covered with dust, because the desert in California is an arid desert, and it gets cold at night and extremely hot during the day, so you had a wide variance of temperature, and the dust was just extensive. When you traveled in those tanks, it kicked up a lot of dust, and as far as maintenance was concerned, about the most important part of our maintenance was keeping the what we call them air cleaners cleaned out.
What was that?
And the air cleaners, where the air goes into the engine, it goes through this air cleaner, and it was had oil in the bottom of them, and the dust would collect 2 inches deep in those air cleaners in just a few hours of travel out there in the desert. So we had to clean those things pretty often.
What would you do? Would you have to do you have to change the oil in that filter?
Oh yes, we'd change the oil in it. We pour it out, clean all the dust out of it, and then put new oil in and put it back in place. But there was Of course, the usual maintenance we had to do every night. We'd be traveling, doing the activities during the day, and then we usually stop at night. And that's when we had to do our maintenance and get a little something to eat and so forth. But we did do some night maneuvering also. But it was a good experience. At the time, I was in a light tank, which is the smallest tank the Army had. And that differed from when I got to the 12th Armored Division. We were in medium tanks, which was a little bit larger vehicle. And we were exposed to tactical problems, administrative, or the actual being responsible for what we did during the problems, as well as we were exposed to the handling the men, looking after their welfare, and just everything that we were trained to do before we got there. And it was an immeasurable experience as far as I'm concerned, because when we got to our home outfit, as we call them, we were pretty well prepared to go.
When you think back to the days later, the months that you were in combat, did you experience any of the same kinds of problems you did on the desert? In other words, did that experience help you at all in your operations in France and Germany?
Well, yes, it was a great help to what we were exposed to in Europe. The main difference from that experience and the one we had in the desert was that the climate was much different. Of course, in Europe, you don't have deserts. There's a lot of rain and snow in the wintertime, and where in California we didn't see a shower of rain more than just enough to wet the ground in the whole 2 months we were out there. The exposure to handling personnel during combat was the training we had before that was real help, because we were exposed to some of the things that took place on maneuvers. The same things or similar things were happening in combat. And I would say that our maneuver experience was very helpful to what we had, or the experiences we had in Europe during combat. And then, of course, the same thing would apply when we're not in active combat. Why, we had a lot of things to do that we had been exposed to during maneuvers in California. But now, we had another maneuver with the 12th. The 12th went on maneuvers in Tennessee for 2 months. And those maneuvers were more like conditions, I would say, than the desert was as far as Europe's activity was concerned. But again, we went through the same types of things that we were exposed to in combat. So it was all very helpful. The maneuvers, I thought, was really a good way to train us during our training period.
Let's pick up the story at Camp Campbell, your arrival there. What do you remember about that first day, if anything?
Well, in our transfer to Camp Campbell, of course, I'd just been married. I got married in August, the 21st of August, and 2 weeks from the time when we were married, we were sent on maneuvers in Tennessee. So my honeymoon didn't last very long.
Well,
but
you told me that you had married an Abilene girl. How in the world did you find an Abilene girl before you ever came to Abilene?
Well, that little experience is kind of interesting as far as I'm concerned. When we left Fort Knox, after our officers' orientation training there, 2 guys and myself went together from Fort Knox to California maneuvers. I'm sorry I can't remember the guys' names, but one was from Tennessee and the other one lived in Louisville, Kentucky. And the guy from Tennessee had a Ford single-seated coupe. I guess 41 model, I think. But anyway, the three of us started out from Fort Knox. Well, actually, we started out from Louisville, Kentucky. This one guy's home. We spent the night with him before we left. And we took off and drove as far as Texarkana, Arkansas, the first day, or before we stopped. We got in there about late in the afternoon, and of course, young as we were, while we were looking for some fun for the night, and we did find some girls, and actually we only found one girl, and so with the other two guys, we stayed around there until the third guy went out with this girl that night, and he came back in, and we took off about 11 o'clock that night, driving west. And the next day about noon, we arrived in Abilene. And it's about noon, yes, we were there. And they were sitting in a drugstore, and one of the guys had been down the street to a military store, and he came in and joined us for a sandwich there in the drugstore, and we were talking about there were a lot of girls in Abilene, nice looking girls. So we were talking about that, and this guy came in, and we were talking, and he said, well, you should see that girl down at the military store. So when we got through eating our sandwich, we went down, and sure enough, see, we saw this girl he was talking about, and she was a nice looking girl. So they had a little entertainment pool table and a ping pong table in the back of the store, and the servicemen would come in there and they'd, have something to do. So we stayed around there. Well, immediately we asked her to go out on a date with us that night. And we told her, we got acquainted, and told her that we would spend the night in Abilene if she would go out with us and find us two more dates. So we didn't want to deal what had the night before, where the two of us would have to twiddle our thumbs while the other guy had the fun. So anyway, she didn't like that idea. So we decided we'd stay a little longer and play some more ping pong. And anyway, make a long story short, about, I would say probably around 5 or 6 o'clock, she finally decided, well, okay. She'd been around us for several hours. And thought it might not be too bad a deal. So she called up two other girls, and we all 6 went out that night. And we had a lot of fun. They had a nightclub place there in Abilene, and you danced a little bit, and I'd never danced in my life before. And she was an excellent dancer. The girl I'm talking about was who I married.
What was her name?
Her name was Laureen Hayes, and she was in high school. And anyway, after we got us a room at the hotel that afternoon, when she decided she would give us some dates for that night. So when we went out, we came back in about, I say about 10, 11 o'clock, and of course they were high school girls and didn't need to get in pretty early. But we had a lot of fun that night, and when we got back to the hotel, I told them I had one other thing about this deal. The night before, I think we drew straws on who was going to go out with the girl. And this night we said, well, we'll let this girl pick who she was going to go out with, and the other two would take whoever she got for us. So anyway, we picked up one girl, and she said, this is your date, and then went to get another girl, and said, this is your date, and so, well, it looks like I'm going to have her for a date. So anyway, we had a fun, like I said. We came back to the hotel, and I said, fellas, I'm going to marry that girl. And I did.
Did she know about this plan yet?
No, she didn't know that. But we spent the night, got a good night's rest, and got in the car, took off the next morning. And during this 2 months in the, well, we were on maneuvers, well, she wrote to me and I wrote to her several times during that couple of months. And when we were sent on our way back to our assigned outfits, and I was going back to Campbell, Kentucky, I stopped in Abilene. And sure enough, she was still there. She had been out to California. Her parents worked. Her father was working out at Ventura, California, in the Navy Yard there. And she went out during that 2 months. She would travel to California. But she had gone back to Abilene and was going back to school there. So I actually took about a week's leave and spent it in Abilene. And when I left, the morning I left to come back, to go on to Fort Campbell, she met me at the depot to get her on the train, and I gave her an engagement ring. So we decided to get married the night before. So I gave her the engagement ring and got on the train and took off. And during the next year, that would have been in about October of '42. During the next year, we wrote extensively and talked on the phone a time or two. And she came to see me in Campbell in early part of August of '43. And at that time, we were still just engaged. But before she left to go back home, we had decided to get married, and we were married, as I say, on the 21st of August of '43. And we had 2 weeks together before we went on maneuvers in Tennessee.
What did her parents think about all this?
Oh, they didn't like it at all.
Did you ever win them over?
Yeah. Yes, I had no problem with them, but the thing that they really didn't like about it, and it was unfair for them, when she came to see me in Tennessee, Kentucky, you know, the Tennessee-Kentucky line ran right through Fort Campbell, so some guys would live in Kentucky and go to work in Tennessee, so we sometimes called it Campbell, Tennessee, and Campbell, Kentucky. But she didn't tell her parents that what she was doing, unfortunately. I say unfortunately now, but it turned out okay. And of course they didn't appreciate her going to Tennessee and getting married without letting them know it. But the first time I saw her parents was when we were transferred to Abilene, and I had no problem in winning them over, and we have had an excellent relation until they passed away in the last 10 or 20 years, I guess. They've been gone.
Before we leave Abilene, do you remember the names of any of the places? For example, the nightclub, was that Charlie Blank's?
Yes. Charlie Blank's was a club that we went to the night we first hit Abilene, yes.
And do you remember what hotel you stayed in?
At the Newton.
At the Newton.
Newton Hotel, yeah. It was a real nice hotel. It was fairly new at the time, and it was a real nice hotel. And of course, places to live in California during that time were really, really scarce. But my wife was always able to find something nice to live in. If it was nothing but a room in a home that the owners of the home were not there and they wanted somebody to take care of the home, which is the case. The first place we lived there was that type. And then she wanted us rented what we called a garage apartment, which was an apartment built above somebody's garage, and it was real nice. So she was a real nice girl, and we had 49 years.
Well, it was a good thing you all didn't go through Amarillo on the way out to California and missed Abilene, wasn't it?
That's right.
Well, tell me a little bit about the 12th Armored Division when you first report. Any people you remember, officers in the 43rd that you encounter in those first days who later became colleagues and friends that you remember?
Well, yes, at the time that I reported to the 12th Armored, it was getting pretty well along being organized. They did not have the full complement of troops. The officers were not complete either, but they filled up fast. So consequently, there were some officers there. Most of the cadre was there at the time, but as they came in, we got acquainted. There were people from A&M School in Texas, from Mississippi colleges. Well, all the colleges across the South that had ROTC units were that's where most of the guys came from. There was some that came from officers training in the service itself. But we got acquainted with each other pretty fast and established some good camaraderie. And the one particular guy that I got acquainted with was named Wayne Gateau. He was from New York, and he was our best man.
What do you remember about him?
Well, he was a tall feller, about I would say around 6 foot tall, and very, very nice guy. He's easygoing, never raised his voice. He was there are a lot of people you can say, well, a bachelor, and that's really what he was. But he was moved from our company, which was B Company, over to 23rd Battalion, one of the companies over there. And that particular guy, I knew him and saw him very often, but he got killed.
Do you remember where?
In the Herlesheim operation. Actually, his company relieved my company, and he was out of his tank and got hit by a sniper. He had 2 tanks knocked out with his activities in the war before that, but he was, unfortunately, he didn't last very long. He was killed almost instantly.
What was his job in the 43rd when he was still with you?
He was a platoon leader, and he was still a platoon leader when he got killed. He was first lieutenant when he got killed, but he was still a platoon and an excellent platoon leader.
Were you still a second lieutenant by the time you get to Campbell?
Well, when I got to Campbell, yes. But when we left Campbell, I was first lieutenant, and I was the maintenance officer. During all the time our training in Fort Campbell, like Camp Campbell at that time, I was the maintenance officer for B Company, and I believe called executive officer with the company. Uh, and I still had that classification and that duties until we were in combat. And at the Hurlsheim experience, we lost all of our, in my company, we lost all the tanks except 5. And of course we lost the company commander and all the officers except myself. So I became company commander that way. And but the other officers that I was acquainted with was one was named Scotty. Leon Scott was his name, and he was with me until he got wounded at Earlsheim and had to go back to the hospital. He lost an eye there. He got hit in the corner of his eye with a sniper shot. So he was sent home at that time, and I still remained in touch with him throughout his life. He died of a heart attack, I believe, I believe it's been about 10 or 12 years ago now.
Where was he from?
He came back from, he was from Muncie, Indiana, and he was in the school teaching business there. And he came back and got his job back from teaching school and became the principal of the school. And he was involved in politics and in Muncie, and he was just a nice guy. And they'd always take a trip during the summer, and they always came by to see me wherever I was. Yeah, I lived in Lubbock and in Midland and Odessa in West Texas, and he'd always come by to see me. And then since I moved to Houston, he came by several times. Unfortunately, I didn't do much traveling myself, but he did, and they liked to travel, and he'd always come by, and we'd have 2 or 3 days together.
Well, tell me a little bit about the maneuvers in Tennessee, and let's take a look at the training phase in more or less chronological order before you head out to Texas and Barkley. You all spend some time in the Tennessee maneuvers. What was that like?
Well, to begin with, we landed in Tennessee in a beautiful meadow alongside the highway on a Saturday afternoon, and we were out there in the middle of the meadow grass. You know, the grass was pretty and green, and softball was our activities when we're not busy. And I liked to play baseball. So I was out there with the men, and several other officers were out there. We were joining them in the activities, and I had been up to bat and went around the bases and came back, and there was down the third base line, there was a group of men sitting on the grass. And I walked down there and sat down right in the middle of them. Which there was 5 or 6 guys on one side and the same number on the other side. And one of the cooks was up to the bat. And he swung that bat and turned it loose. And he really swung at the ball. But he missed the ball and turned the bat loose, and somebody said, "Look out." And about that time, I was looking kind of like this, and somebody said, "Look out." So I looked that way, and that bat hit me right in the mouth. That's why I've got this scar here. And my experience from that point on was that cook, he really took care of me. I couldn't chew anything for several weeks, but I got real good service out of that kitchen. But as far as other activities during Tennessee maneuvers, what principally involved field activities or field problems, we called it, and which involved all types of training that we had been trained in, which and my job as maintenance officer was to keep all the supplies coming and all the maintenance work done and see the vehicles were ready to go and keep the company commander informed to the condition of the vehicles and those that were not operable and how many we had ready and so forth. So I didn't have a whole lot of duties as far as the tactics were concerned. However, I was still trained in them, and I was prepared to take a platoon leader's job or somebody else's if that became necessary. But my job was less from a tactical standpoint than the platoon leaders were. But the activities that the company did during that time was, of course, operating with the battalion and the division and so forth, and we were every day on some type of operation. We spent some time on the firing ranges, getting experience in firing the weapons and so forth, but a lot of the time we were spent on tactical problems and the things involved with that, which is what you do when you go to war. You just use your training in whatever comes up. The weather was, as I recall, was pretty good. We had some wet weather. We had a river crossing problem, and the terrains and the weather and so forth was I would say somewhat similar to that we experienced in Europe. It was much different from what we had in the desert. But there was not much going on in the desert in those days, and we were preparing to go to Europe properly.
Any NCO enlisted personnel that stands out in your mind that worked for you or under you?
Oh yes, I've had one sergeant that was maintenance sergeant. He was a tech sergeant in grade, and he was the NCO that was in charge of the maintenance crew. We had a crew of, it varied from time, but we had a group of 10 or 15 mechanics and supply people and so forth in our maintenance section. And this sergeant was named Tyler. I can't recall his first name now, but he saved me and trained me because he was an experienced person in life, and
about how old was he at that time? Much older than you?
He was in his 30s. Of course, I was an old man at that time, as far as we were concerned. I was only, see, I was only 24 years old when I went overseas. And to have somebody 30, 32 years old that was a good person was an asset indeed. But he took care of that crew too. Him, and he didn't only just look after me, but he did look after me.
Did you ever contact him after the war? You know what happened to him?
No, well, I didn't, because he lived in Long Island, New York, and I didn't do any traveling. I had a Christmas card too, but other than that, we never did see each other. The other guy was the first sergeant, Andy McGuire. And he was a number one first sergeant, and I have seen him a number of times since at conventions or talked to him and got Christmas cards from him. And there was another what we call platoon sergeant. I can't think of his name right now, but he was a great guy, and he was always sending everybody Christmas cards afterwards. But in our in our company, we had excellent camaraderie, and everybody looked after everybody else, and I'm sure that was existed in all companies. Hopefully it did, but we got along real well. We knew everybody and knew what they were doing and what they needed and so forth. And when we were called on to do something, we had the guys trained and ready and did it.
What about the movement back to Campbell? How long were you there before the division moved to Texas?
You mean from maneuvers?
Yes, after you finished maneuvers and went back to Campbell.
We went to Tennessee maneuvers, and we didn't see Campbell anymore. We went from Tennessee maneuvers. I was chosen on the advanced crew to go to Camp Chaffee, Arkansas, and pick up vehicles. And that was everything, I believe, except the tanks. I think they were moved by rail, but all the trucks and those smaller vehicles we drove from Chaffee, Arkansas to Abilene.
So in a convoy?
In a convoy on the highways. And we drove all day and spent the night in Arlington, Texas, in the old fairgrounds there, and then we drove one in Abilene the next day. But that's about the extent of what took place in the movement from Tennessee, because we left our vehicles in Tennessee and somebody else came in and took them over. So we had to get new equipment who somebody else had left it for. I think they left it at Chaffee, and I was all shipped down there at Abilene. I think we were the first division to go to Berkeley in Abilene.
There were several infantry divisions that were there before.
The medics training segment, and maybe an infantry division. Yes, there was an infantry division went there before us, but I believe we were the first tanks to go there.
What did you find? What do you remember about that day when you all pulled in? What did you find in the way of company areas and that kind of thing, housing?
Well, it was it was something that we really hadn't experienced before, because there was no trees anywhere. There were some streets laid out, and some fabricated huts for barracks. And there wasn't anything that looked like the comforts of home at all. But we made it okay. We got when we got to our area, of course, like I say, the barracks that we had were fabricated being they were built with plywood board, siding, stuff like that. They did have some windows in them, and everything on the camp was built out of that type of material. Maybe the mess hall was made out of regular lumber, but then there was a lot of training grounds, and the motor pools and everything like that were some types of terrain is good for that type of activity, because you didn't have to worry about a lot of rain. There was not a lot of mud. But when it did rain in that area, the mud was terrible. And the vehicles would just bog out of sight when we really got wet. I mean, it didn't do that very often, but occasionally it did. So having moved around already some while we were expecting anything, and we made do with what we got.
What do you remember about training there? How long was it before the rest of the unit arrived?
Well, they were arriving every day. Some of them had got the people. Some of the just people had gotten there before we did. But all of them, they came in pretty fast. Of course, there's so many things that I haven't thought about in years, and I can't remember exactly all what all happened, but as I recall, the weather and everything at Abilene was not disagreeable, meaning that, like I said, we didn't have a whole lot of rain, and it's always easy to operate when you're not having rain going down your neck. The ground was hard. Didn't have a whole lot of problems getting vehicles around. There was a lot of cleachy in that country that was used to put on the roadways, and there was a very good material to put on roadways to maintain stability and so forth. It was just a new home, and we made do with what it was.
What, as an officer, how did your housing arrangements, having your wife, of course, there with you since that was your hometown, how did that work out? Operations was, is there a problem getting home?
Well, no, somebody usually had a car, and there were people who were married as I was, and their wives, and my wife had found a place to live beforehand, and we kind of carpooled into town and back every day. There was a lot of days that we didn't go to California. A lot of days during this time we were out in the field on tactical problems. I mean, we start out sometime on Monday morning and while we were in Abilene, and not be back in the camp until maybe Friday or Saturday. Sometimes we'd be out there over the weekend. Now, that took a lot of our time. During the time I was in Abilene, I went to a 1 month, what was called Gunnery School in Fort Knox. And that was, there we went again over all the guns, updated on we were getting newer tanks, and we were going from 75 millimeter to 76 millimeter main guns and so forth. So periodically somebody would go in and get schooled up on the later equipment, and then came back and instructed the personnel on these things. Also, during that, let's see, we were in Abilene about 9 months, I guess, altogether. And during that time also, I went to a maintenance school, which was a 3 month deal. When we studied those tanks from one end to the other. I mean, everything that was on them, from tracks to rear wheels and differentials and powertrains and armor plating and everything about that tank we knew from one end to the other before we went back home from that, which it prepared us. It's all of our maintenance personnel went to those schools also.
Where was the maintenance school located? It's
in Fort Knox. All armored training at that time was done in Fort Knox, and that was considered armored training. And during that time, my wife moved to a little town between Fort Knox and Louisville on the river. And so I was lucky enough there that I got some other guys were going that way during the day, and I'd ride with them and ride back in. We weren't supposed to be married and going to that school, but I was, and I got to see my wife nearly every night while I was in those schools. So that wasn't too bad. I had experience while I was in at school that historically I'd had a lot of problems with tonsils. And I still had my tonsils. And I got a big case of tonsillitis there one day, and went down to the infirmary, and they kind of give me a or an aspirin or so, and they did take a swab of my throat. And in my experience had been, like you know, doctor yourself if you can. So I got me a bottle of peroxide and started gargling with peroxide, and in about a day or so, I was okay. And because I had done this before. But about 3 days later, they came from the dispensary and got me out of class and took me back down to the dispensary, and they said, "Man, you're sick." And they wanted to put me in the hospital. I said, "No, Doc, I'm okay now." So he took a look and said, "Yeah, sure are." So go back to class. So anyway, we had some funny things to happen there once in a while.
What do you remember about the pullout? Well, let me ask you before we get to that. Mrs. Meigs, Colonel Meigs's widow, told me a couple of years ago that General Brewer was very much opposed to having officers' wives there, or I guess any wives for that matter, that this was no place for them, that it interfered with training and so on. Did you ever encounter any attitude like that?
Well, yes, the one time at the school I mentioned that the wives were not supposed to be there, but nobody ever got in any major trouble on account of it, because we didn't let it interfere, because you were supposed to be there for training on a certain time in the morning, and if you hadn't been, I guess there would have been some problem. But there was that existed. But fortunately, I never was really involved in anything of any that turned out to be a problem.
At Barclay, you didn't experience any kind of
No.
problems with that?
No, because, I got our company officers, if your company commander's got his wife that lives in town and he wants to go see her every night, why then that kind of makes it a little bit easier for everybody else, And actually, I think what we did, as I recall, it was never a problem, because we were there on time when we were supposed to be. And if we hadn't been, well, we might have been a problem.
What do you remember about the packing up and pulling out for Europe, the trip as well? Tell us a little bit about that whole thing.
Well, of course, when we got the word that we were going to go someplace, we didn't know where. Everybody did get high behind packing. And we packed our personal equipment as well as the vehicles and that. But and I can't remember now that you mentioned that, we seemed to me like that we put a lot of vehicles on that train. We had to pack everything a certain way, and we had instructions on how to do all those kind of things, and put it on the train to be shipped out. But we didn't get that equipment, because when we got to Europe, we got absolutely brand new tanks and vehicles. They were still in codmalene. We had to get the codmalene off the guns and everything in order for them to function, and then we had to take them down to the southern shores of England there and practice shooting them out in the ocean. So I don't know where those vehicles went. But as far as personnel is concerned, why, we were instructed on how to do everything and pack it, and when we had to be ready. And we had a duffel bag, and that was about it as far as containers for your personal property. We did have officers had foot lockers. And at that time, I believe those foot lockers were shipped with us. But we put them someplace, and then somebody took them there. But to take along with us, we just had a duffel bag. Everything we wanted to take was in that. And I don't remember whether we took a gun with us from Abilene or not, but I don't believe we did. I can't remember for sure. But anyway, it was just something that people had learned to accept and did the best they could. And as far as your wife concerned, why we were restricted several days before we left. We couldn't see them. And of course, we didn't know where we were going, and we couldn't tell them where we were going either, because we didn't know, so we couldn't tell them. So it was 2 or 3 days before we left that we really didn't see them. Couldn't call them on the phone or anything else. Phone service at that time is not like it is today, by a long shot, because there wasn't as many phones in the first place, and cellular phones were not in existence. So today, my daughters and their families, they all carry a cellular phone around in a purse, and if they want to call somebody, no matter where it is, they can do it. There's some sitting right here. But we didn't have that kind of communications at that time. But there was nothing outstanding that happened that I can recall.
Well, so did you see your wife before you left in that 3-day period?
No. It was at least 2 days before we left. They said, this is the last time you're going to see him. And that was.
What about the train trip? Did your unit go to Camp Shanks?
Yeah. We went to Camp Shanks, and we got on that train and left out of Abilene, left out of Barclay. That's where we left from. And never having been on a troop train before, everybody had heard about him, and it was an experience. But it wasn't too bad. I mean, they'd stop every once in a while. They could get off and rest a little bit, and they'd serve chow 2 or 3 times a day, which meant you stopped. And the kitchen was in one car, and they'd serve a meal, and everybody would pack up and get back on the train and take off again. And it took us, oh gosh, I can't remember. It took us 4 or 5 days to get from Barclay to Camp Shanks. So we got in there in the middle of the night. There were barracks and everything for us to stay in, and we still didn't know where we were going to go when we got on a boat. We just were told we were going to get on a boat sometime and go somewhere. So anyway, when we got into Shanks, well, I don't think we were there more than 2 or 3 days, and we were allowed to go into New York City one evening, which I enjoyed. I'd never been in New York, never been there since, but I did enjoy the few hours we spent in. I was with some guys that had been there and were familiar with where it was, and we rode the subway and saw a few things, a show or so, and we had a good evening. But there was really nothing bad about the experience that I can recall. It was just something that I didn't want to be doing, but I had to do it, so I just made the best of it.
One thing I failed to ask you back at Barclay, General Brewer and a number of other officers were relieved of their commands, and General Green came in. Do you remember anything about the circumstances around that, and how that filtered down to the 43rd?
Well, I think I know the incident you're talking about, and it took place when I was in maintenance school in Fort Knox. It took place while I was gone. And my understanding is what happened was that, when every unit is sent overseas for combat, they had to put them through a test of some type, which included I think everything that we had to do, from supplies to tactics, to how you maneuver in doing your tactical operations, you know, and what you did and how it worked and how well the men seemed to be trained. And it's my understanding that we didn't pass. And that's when they relieved General Brewer, I believe. I know when I got back, this had just happened. And we went into an extensive few weeks of training. And I guess somebody checked us again and said, "You're ready to go." And this I think I got back to the company must have been in July or August. And the intense training was going on when I got there. And so we left. We got on a train and left Barclay September the 20th, as I recall. So sometime between the time they took that first test, which was sometime during the summer, and in September, we must have got ourselves in shape.
Were there any changes in the 43rd command structure as a result of this? Or did it remain the same, like battalion commander?
Well, no, I don't believe the 43rd Battalion at that time. See, we started out as a 43rd Regiment, armored regiment, and Brewer was our commander of that regiment, and he got promoted when they reorganized and broke the regiments up into the battalions. Sometime along in the end, I think he got a promotion. He was a wing colonel at that time. But I don't believe that the 43rd actually had any command changes. Now, I don't know what the problem was, but there was something about the 12th Armored that they didn't think he was ready to go overseas. And that's when Brewer was relieved and General Green came in.
You have any personal experiences with either of those two men?
No, nothing other than just seeing them and speaking to them. No personal activities, no. No, the only personal activities I had with any higher officers was an experience during combat. And will you want me to give you that?
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, it was in March, I guess, of 45. And we'd been through the Hurlstein deal, and we'd been back in the rest area, and we'd been resupplied with equipment and personnel, and did some training of those. We were getting people from the States who had had very little training and were very young. I mean, they were getting teenagers. And they didn't know, had not had a chance to learn much about combat. So we did a little training with them, and as well as getting with our new equipment. But anyway, we had been looking at the front line, and our higher officers were telling us daily what was going on and what probably would happen to us. So we had a few little skirmishes, but then we were told to go up through Luxembourg. We got just the edge over there, and then we turned back going east towards the Rhine River. And we were going down a highway there that had lots of German animals, horses, carts and stuff that had been strafed by American planes or Allied planes alongside the highway. We passed along, and we had, I believe it was 5 piles of bombs that were probably 500-pound equivalent. The piles of bombs was larger than this house, and along beside the road, and primer cord was wrapped all around these bombs, I'm sure with the intention of blowing those piles of bombs up as we passed by, but we passed right along beside them, and we had we saw one explosion on the far end of it, and we got down there, and somebody was looking after us, I guess. And the primer cord was set off, and it only went through the first batch, and probably cut itself off or something, but it was severed, and the charge never went on down through the piece, so we felt like we were lucky there. So anyway, we passed that up and went on down till we got to the Rhine River, and we turned south, which was going towards Switzerland that way. It seems backwards to me sometimes when you say south, when we were actually going what would normally be north here in this country. But anyway, we went on down there. We passed through towns. So we hit the river somewhere around Worms, and we started. It was actually up the river, is what I'm trying to say. And we passed through several little